Thanks for having me here. It's so nice to be with you. This actual lecture I'm giving now, we give at the Academy to every Academy group that comes in. So the younger generation that went through the Franklin and Hampshire County Academy have already heard this talk, right? And we have to catch the rest of us up. I'm a normal family doctor, total brand new baby, day hour one of life, all the way to I have 104-year-old patient in my practice. I grew up locally. I grew up in Franklin County in the far, far part of Worcester County. I went to a local public high school. I used to come to Northampton to go shopping and go to the movies, to Hampshire Malls where I used to hang out and skate. So I'm a total local girl. And I also have other roles. I'm both a normal primary care doctor, but I've become an addiction doctor in the last 6 or 8 years because I kind of had to, because there wasn't anybody else doing it and we had a massive opiate epidemic happening, as everybody here knows. I am the medical director at the Franklin County House of Corrections. And I also run a drug and alcohol treatment center, 64-bed alcohol and drug treatment center in Greenfield. So I have lots of different jobs, and we're going to spend time talking about the human brain and what happens to the human brain when exposed to an addictive substance. And while I'm talking, I want you to think a little bit about some of the people who are behind bars here, but also some of the people in your life that you've known, right? Because most of us have grown up in families where we know people or live with people who struggle with addiction. It's such a common problem. You don't have to have run into trouble with the law to have struggled with addiction. It's such a familiar thing to so many of us if we're willing to be honest with ourselves. So we're going to talk about this extraordinary organ that is encased in your skull. And this organ, the brain, is this one organ that really changes during your lifespan. Your kidneys don't change. You come out, they get a little bigger as you get bigger yourself, but they're doing the exact same thing on day one as they do on the final day of your life. They function a little less well at the end, but in general, they do great. And that's true for your liver and your pancreas and every other organ in the body. But the brain is shifting substantially in the first 25 years, and then it continues to shift and sadly decline, as most of us know as we get older. So the part of the brain that is impacted with addiction is known as the reward circuit of the brain. It's the part of the brain that gives you this positive feedback for getting up every day and surviving. It's the live or die part of the brain. It's the most ancient elemental part of the brain. 3 specific areas, but many parts of the brain are impacted. But the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the amygdala, all of these tiny parts of the brain are involved when it comes to addiction. And what we know is this most ancient elemental part of the brain, this part of the brain that's in the cricket and the koala and in every one of us, is the part of the brain that tells us to get up every day, find food, find water, and find a mate. Because our entire purpose of being on this planet is to send our genetic material forward and keep that next generation or two alive. Now, most of us didn't wake up this morning thinking that way. But at our most basic human selves, that is our job. It just is. And it is this part of the brain that is impacted with addiction. That's the problem. That is the problem with the disease of addiction, is it breaks the part of the brain that tells you to live or die. And if we could magically pick up and move the part of the brain that is impacted with addiction, and we moved it to the auditory cortex, and you just lost your high frequency sound availability, who cares, right? I wouldn't let you pilot a jumbo jet, but otherwise you would have a normal life. But instead, the part of your brain that has to do with survival is the part of the brain that breaks. And it is such a frustrating disease to treat. It really is. And you guys know this, because anybody who's working in a correctional facility, you every day are treating people with addiction. 80 to 90 to 93% of every one of our correctional facilities are people with substance use disorder. And they can be super hard to treat sometimes. And there's all times during the year where I just want to dope slap somebody, but of course I never hit anybody, but in my head I want to, because it becomes really frustrating at times. Because you see the same people again and again. You see siblings of the same people. You have sometimes where you have a father and a son in the same facility. It's not easy. The part of the brain, this reward circuit that we're talking about, has one major neurotransmitter racing through it called dopamine. And how does dopamine make you feel? Happy, right? Happy, joyous, euphoric, awesome. That's a lovely, lovely neurotransmitter. It itself is not a problem. It's fabulous. And what it says to the brain is, holy smokes, that was awesome. Do it again. It is a very beneficial neurotransmitter when it comes to survival. Because when you found that there was a 5-point buck racing through your land and you were able to kill it, your family stayed alive for another 2 weeks. And you got a spike in dopamine that said, bucks are good, they keep your family alive, aim well, right? Spike in dopamine, and then it goes back to normal. That's the way the brain works. Dopamine has with it strongly associated fine motor skills. It's one of the things I actually think we don't do well in treatment. I don't think we do it well in corrections either. You need to occupy the fingers. The fingers, when they're occupied, help move the brain away from craving cycle. It helps distract the brain and can help heal the brain. And I'm not saying this is the answer in all correctional facilities, but in a treatment facility, quite honestly, people need to be coloring and doing puzzles and doing a beading project and doing really complicated little chart fill outs, and they should be knitting and crocheting because the finger distraction helps to heal the brain as well. Right? I can't imagine having knitting needles at my Franklin County House of Corrections, but you can imagine other things that happily occupy the fingers that aren't going to be harmful. Associated with dopamine in the brain are two specific behaviors: compulsion and perseveration. I have to do this thing. I am unable to stop thinking about this thing. That's what compulsion and perseveration mean. And when it came to survival, being a compulsive human being, being a perseverator, ruminating all the time about how to keep your family alive, super beneficial behaviors when it comes to survival. Your ancestors were compulsive and perseverating, and thank God for that, right? Because that's why you're here, is they were so good at going to bed. The last thought they had before they went to bed is, how am I going to keep my family alive tomorrow? Because guess what? It used to be really hard. 200 years ago, finding enough calories to survive was unbelievably challenging, right? I mean, we have it so easy now. We have 1 billion calories at the checkout counter at a gas station. That is not what the world is like. We have not evolved in any way from the world in which we were really on the edge of starvation all the time. It's one of the reasons most of us carry excess weight, is because we haven't changed our brains or our behaviors, yet we have access to way too many calories. So this is how dopamine looks in the brain, and I make an argument that at a baseline there's a range of normal and human dopamine levels, and some of us are these happy-go-lucky golden retrievers on the planet, and we have baseline high dopamine. Our dopamine sits at 108 every day. We feel great. Some of us have baseline low dopamine, and maybe we sit at 90, a little lower, and we have to do a whole bunch of things that make us feel better, right? A lot of us exercise a lot, or garden, or cook, or do a hobby that makes us feel better. And so there's a normal human range in our brain of dopamine. The problem is that when you have a baseline and have an average, let's say, of 100 units of dopamine on average in this room, and from an evolutionary standpoint, you're able to, catch the salmon or kill the deer and keep your family alive, you get a spike in dopamine to 150, and then it goes back to normal. Most of us aren't catching salmon or killing deer. Most of us just saw that giant plate of cookies back there that looked delicious and got a little dopamine spike when we ate it, right? Dopamine goes to 150 and then it goes back to normal. You have sex, it's consensual, your dopamine goes to 200 and then it goes back to normal. These are the holy smokes, it is awesome, do it again behavior, and your brain is telling you to continue this behavior because it is good for the survival of your species, right? The problem is when you introduce addictive substances or behaviors, because that's when we start to see a disruption in the dopamine system. So you use a drug like cocaine and your dopamine will go to 350. You use a drug like a strong prescription opiate or heroin or fentanyl and your dopamine will go to 500 to 1,000 or even higher. I have no idea how high it can go with fentanyl, something really high. You use a drug like crystal methamphetamine and your dopamine will go to 1,300. Huge levels, right? And the real question is, why aren't we getting up every morning and take a hit of meth? Because that seems like an awesome idea. 1,300, I'm in. So let's talk about how the brain perceives this. So there's 3 things in the equation that govern the dopamine in the brain. How much dopamine is produced, how many little dopamine receptors are on the other side of the synaptic cleft receiving the information, and how many little vacuums are sucking the dopamine out of the active part of the brain. And every addictive behavior and substance affects something in that equation. I'm not going to torture you and talk you through video game addiction. I'm just going to cover 2 fast ones here, okay? Cocaine works only in one way. Super easy drug to understand, not a complicated pathway. All cocaine does is turn off the vacuum. And when the vacuums aren't in there vacuuming the dopamine out of the synaptic cleft, you build up to a 350. You would think that a cocaine use disorder would be really easy to treat because I just need some little vaccine that interrupts the the vacuum so that it doesn't listen to the cocaine. That's all I need. Somebody's going to make billions of dollars in this room when they figure it out. Instead, there's no treatment for cocaine use disorder. I just look at people and say, stop using cocaine. It's bad for your organs. Bad. Stop. That's the best I have to offer people with a cocaine use disorder. We do contingency management where we'll pay people like a $5 Dunkin' Donuts gift card once a week not to use cocaine. Believe it or not, that actually does work too, but you know, long term it doesn't work very well. So that's the way cocaine works in the brain. Heroin works through a more complicated system. It goes through the mu opiate receptor, and then there's a negative feedback loop with the GABA receptor. But at the end of the day, all opiates make more dopamine and shove it out into the active part of the brain. That's the way the opiates work, okay? I'm not going to talk through everything, but everything, every addictive behavior, gambling, sex, gaming, every addictive substance, nicotine, marijuana, which is, by the way, an addictive substance, cocaine, name the substance, it all ends up in the dopamine system. Sometimes it takes many steps to get there, but this is where it ends up. So the problem with the brain is when you, for 200,000 years, have been in this human form, that we are sitting here in this form, for 200,000 years, your brain is used to 90, 150, 200 on an awesome night. When it sees spikes of 350, 900, and 1300, your brain says, oh my God, something is wrong here, right? What is going on? This isn't okay. And it starts to down-regulate. It starts to turn down the volume. It stops making dopamine. It erases 80% of the dopamine receptors, and it turns on every vacuum in sight. So it's just sucking the dopamine out. So when people struggle with addiction, and addiction doesn't start on day one, right? Addiction is a behavioral change in a brain switch. It takes weeks, maybe even months, before somebody has really developed a true dependence and addiction on a drug. But people who struggle with addiction wake up in the morning and their new dopamine set point isn't 90 or 105, right? They wake up in the morning and their dopamine is a 40 or a 45. They're miserable. They're miserable human beings that do not have enough dopamine in their brain to be consistent with survival, right? In the old days, they would have just died. But instead, their brain's like, oh my God, something's wrong. Your dopamine's at 40. You got to fix this. You know how to fix this, right? There's one way through fixing this that's easy to do, and you know how to do it. So start digging around in your mattress and see what was left over from your sleeve of nips from last night, because there's got to be something there, right? I'm going to go through my bathroom toilet or the garbage pan there and just figure out, is there any heroin I can scrape out of that bag? Because I need to feel better than this, right? That is what the brain is screaming to do, and it actually makes sense. You should want to fix a dopamine of 40. And if in the past the way you fixed it is by drinking or drugging, that will be your return go-to. Dopamine gets better in the brain, but it does not happen in a night or 5 or 7 days of detoxing. It doesn't even happen in a month. It takes a year and a half or 3 years, depends on the drug, to get your brain better and restore your dopamine. And it takes a lot of positive things coming your way. And we're going to talk about that towards the end. So it's this concept of a broken brain. And it's complicated. I make the story very simple so that we're all on the same page together. But I also acknowledge that the number of features of the brain that are disrupted with addiction are many. And what we know is that there's this cycle that people get on. There's this cycle of I'm using and I'm high, and then I'm chasing the high and I'm not really high. And then I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I've got to get off this stuff. And then when they're off it, which by the way is every time they're in a house of corrections, they're away from the substance that they've been chasing or has been chasing them for so many years, they enter into this green phase of the cycle called preoccupation and anticipation. This is a normal state of being, and most people have cravings for the substance, I don't know, 190 times a day. Now, they may have a craving for the substance while they're incarcerated. They're not going to, most times, have access to it. But in the real world, people in recovery are having cravings throughout the day, all day long, and they walk away from the drug. I don't know who in this room has tried to quit cigarettes. It's hard to quit cigarettes. And for those of us who've successfully done it, you will crave that cancer stick really 50, 90 times a day. And if you just let 2 minutes pass, the craving will go away. But you gotta let 2 minutes pass without running to the corner store and buying a pack of cigarettes, because by that time you've launched yourself down the rabbit hole. So the problem is that everybody in a house of correction is still in this addiction cycle. They're just in the green part of the cycle of preoccupation and having cravings, which is why everybody who leaves our facility who walked in as a smoker became a non-smoker with us, because you can't smoke cigarettes in any house of corrections, How many of them relapse with cigarettes? Almost all of them do. Over 90% of people leaving jail start smoking again. Even though they've been with us for 2 years, you would think they're a non-smoker, right? You would say that. But that's 6 weeks prior to release. They're planning it out. They're thinking about it. That green part of the brain is getting super active. They're like, who's going to pick me up at the curb? Are they going to have $11 on them? I wonder what they're selling, anything new or different, or the packaging's different. What corner store am I going to go to? They are planning the relapse before they leave us, okay? And so we have a lot of green parts of the brain. The part of the problem with the green part of the brain is it interacts with the prefrontal cortex, or the impulse control. That's just the way it is. And it is normal to relapse when you leave jail. In fact, not only is it normal, it is expected. It is the norm. And this is what we're trying to prevent. Now, truth is, all of our smokers, we should be looking at them and saying, you are a non-smoker now. You need to stay a non-smoker because your lungs are awesome. I see you out in the yard playing basketball. You are fit and furious, but you return to cigarettes and it's going to be all over. Let's talk about preventing your relapse to cigarettes now, right? Let's get a small dose patch on you. Let's get some gum going for you, because I don't want you to relapse. And the truth is, in many ways, you don't want to relapse on nicotine either. Tobacco is the #1 killer in our country. Why would I shoot people out my door to relapse on nicotine? It's not good for their health. I think everybody in this room would agree with me on that, right? It reduces healthcare costs. That is good for society. You just need to apply that thinking to an opiate use disorder, because guess what? It's not any different. So I want to talk about what happens every single day. And I'm going to use my local emergency room right down the street from us. And it's not that I'm calling them out. I just know how things look. Okay, and I know this because I'm a local doctor and I work in a hospital. So in this great town of Northampton, this is a 68-year-old guy on the upper right side, and he wakes up at 5:30 in the morning with an elephant sitting on his chest, and he's rubbing his sternum, and his wife's like, what is wrong with you? And he's like, I don't know, it must have been what I ate last night. And she's like, I'm calling 911. She calls 911, and there we have fire, we have police, we have EMTs in that living room like in 7 minutes. And they look at this guy and they're like, you're having a massive heart attack. They give him a sublingual nitroglycerin and a beta blocker. They make him chew an aspirin. Maybe it's a cardiac truck. They get into big bore IV. They actually are able to send an EKG to the local hospital. The local hospital said, whoa, don't send him here. Don't get on I-91 South, because this guy doesn't belong here, because he needs massive cardiac intervention, and we can't do that locally. He ends up at a giant tertiary quaternary hospital, and he is in, they start warming up the cath lab, they shut it down, warm up the OR, because this guy needs quadruple bypass surgery. And he's in the operating room within an hour, getting all of his little valves of his heart realigned, okay? And then he goes to the cardiac ICU for another week, and then he's on med surg for another week. He has a few complications. Then he goes out for 12 weeks of cardiac rehab. He's a new cardiologist, new primary care doctor, a new therapist, because he gets pretty depressed. How much money we just spend on him? What was that? A lot, for sure. Anybody have a number for me? 40. Yeah, 40 is just turning on the OR. It takes $60,000 to get the operating room running. About $250,000 is my guess. About $200,000 to $250,000. Depends on what part of the country we're in, but in Massachusetts, $250,000, okay? His next door neighbor in Northampton is this 24-year-old kid. She's lying on the ground in this picture, but she's 24 now, but she used to be a Northampton High School superstar soccer player who got a full ride to Boston College to play soccer. When she was 19, doing great on the soccer team, she blew out her ACL. Couldn't walk, couldn't run, couldn't play soccer. And although she tried to rehab it and she had surgery, her college said, look, your career's over. And she lost her scholarship, she lost her dream. And she realized that the opiate that was prescribed to her by the orthopedic surgeon was like the only thing that made her feel happy anymore, because her life felt like it was over. And so for 6 weeks, she went back to that orthopedic surgeon looking for a script. And finally, the orthopedic surgeon was like, I don't know what's wrong with you, but I'm cutting you off. She began buying pills on the street, realized that was super expensive, and she quickly converted to snorting heroin. Her life really, really went down the drain, and everything that goes wrong with people who struggle went wrong with her, right? She lost her family, she hung out with all the wrong people, she overdosed a couple times, she lost everything. But for the last year, she's been doing great. She moved back home with her mom. She got rid of the bad boyfriend. She's been seeing a therapist. She's been going to 12-step meetings. She's going to a local Suboxone clinic. She's been on Suboxone for the last 9 months. She just got her first job. She hasn't worked in forever. Well, she has work, but not paid work that is paid in real human dollars. But she actually is now working. She got her first paycheck a couple days ago. But her mom knocks on the bathroom door at 5:30 in the morning and finds the door locked and no response behind it. Her mom's a smart woman and realizes there's something wrong on the other side. She gets a spike in adrenaline, kicks the door down, and finds her 24-year-old daughter lying on the ground, blue and not breathing. She calls 911. She starts CPR, and she administers Narcan, but her daughter doesn't start breathing again. By this time, Northampton patrol cars have arrived, and every patrol car in Northampton is carrying 2 vials of Narcan. It takes 4 more vials of Narcan for this young woman to start breathing again. And they bring her down to the local ER, and what happens to her? That's exactly right. They hold her for a couple hours. They don't even treat any of her symptoms, which, by the way, are a lot, and then they send her to the street. They probably take the time to make her feel like a piece of trash during that 2 hours, too. So let's go back to her next door neighbor, that 68-year-old guy, okay? I didn't tell you his full story. He has significant cardiovascular genetic risk in his family. His dad died of a heart attack at the age of 62. His mom had a massive stroke at his exact age of 68. He smokes 1.5 packs a day of cigarettes. He kicks back a 12-pack of beer every day, and he would go to McDonald's 7 days a week if he could, but his wife knows about that, and so he only goes 3 days. Does this guy struggle with addiction? Yeah, what's he addicted to? Did somebody say everything? Yeah, he's addicted to a lot of things, yeah. Nicotine, alcohol, fat, sugar, whatever horrible chemicals are in fast food. He's addicted to all of it, right? Did he create his heart attack? He did, 100%. I'm not even giving him 99%. He created his heart attack. Yeah, he had some genetic risk, but both of his parents were smokers. You get rid of the tobacco in that family, they may or may not have any genetic risk, okay? He created his heart attack because he's an addict, period, right? But when EMS rolled into his living room, when he showed up in the ER, when he was with the cardiothoracic surgeon post-op, did anybody wag their finger at him and say, dude, you created this hot mess? You're an addict, you're a piece of trash, I'm not going to provide you any medical care? Did anybody do that to him? No, they didn't, in fact, and nor should they have, right? Who in this room is perfect? Who in this room is a vegan marathon runner, never eats sugar, goes to yoga, can do crazy yoga moves? Who's that person? Right. Because guess what? We're human beings, and very few of us do everything right all the time. I don't shoot heroin, right? I guess I can pat myself on the back for that. That's all good. But I'm a sugar addict. I am. Like, truly cannot control my sugar. Now, who in this room recognizes their own, let's pretend the easy one, sugar problem and has tried to get off sugar? Who's tried to get off sugar in this room? Okay. How long did it take for you for the cravings to decrease? Okay, you've tried to get off, right? Okay, she's tried to enter sugar recovery and she's been unable to succeed. Okay, so who's actually done it? Anybody done it successfully? Nobody? Okay, for 2 months. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Listen to this, a real success story. Somebody went off sugar for 2 months, which is a super long time. Having cravings with sugar, they go away about 5 days. After just 5 days, your cravings go way down. But guess what? It's still really hard. This time of year, all I want to do is eat sugar. Those cookies that people make in the holiday season, I'm thinking about them all right now. My favorite cookies come out this time of year. I love them, right? Sugar's not good for you. It's not going to lock you up in jail, but it's actually really bad for your health. What we actually know about sugar is more and more, it's really bad for us. It's like a little bit of poison that we add in all day long, okay? So stop thinking that we're all better than everybody else, because we all struggle in our own way. And what bothers me, and the reason I spend so much time on this slide, is we took 2 human beings who were struggling and having a medical problem, and we gave one every resource, and in fact, the best medical care provided in the world at the cost of $250,000. And we gave a 24-year-old absolutely nothing. Nothing. You know what needed to happen to that kid? Somebody needed to look at her and say, you've been doing really well. Your mom told me how good you've been. That's awesome. But you know what we know? We know that relapse happens really commonly. It happens between 6 and 12 months routinely, because when you start to feel better, when you start to feel normal again, you think you can dip your toe back in. But there's no dipping in your toe with heroin because it all has fentanyl in it and it will kill you, right? So somebody just needed to pat her on the back, say, look, I'm worried about you because this happened, and I'm wondering, do we need to get more resources coming your way? Have you stopped going to meetings every day because you're now working? Have you actually not been seeing your therapist every week? You guys went down to every 2 weeks because you were so good. Maybe you actually can't manage your own money right now. I know you just got paid for the first time 2 days ago, but having money in your pocket for the first time in your life is going to burn a hole there. So I'm going to talk to your mom about her managing your money, right? This is the conversation. You know who needed to do it? A great nurse. That's all I needed. I needed to spend $1 on this young woman. I needed to have her not walk out of that place feeling like a piece of trash, because that's somebody who's going to continue to use. But if somebody had spent 10 minutes with her, she is somebody who could have acknowledged that relapse is common, it's the norm, and we're going to get you better again. That's all it would have taken. Until our ERs treat these two human beings the same, we have a lot of work to do. Everything I just said applies to what happens in a jail. We provide medical care to everybody who walks in this building. When my diabetics come in on their insulin, they stay on their insulin. When my people come in on their 3 hypertension agents, I try to change their diet and have them lose weight, but I'm going to keep them on their 3 high blood pressure medicines. My psych patients stay on their meds. Why the heck do I yank people off who have been stable on methadone, on naltrexone, or buprenorphine, yank them off, make them have severe withdrawal in a facility that does not really have the capacity to manage it, put them through huge amount of suffering, put myself and my medical license at liability risk? Why are we doing that? It makes no sense. Okay, so this just reminds you, for my non-medical people in the world, every disease in the body has to do with the disruption of the messaging system. I could be doing cardiovascular disease or diabetes. Even a lot of cancers have a disruption in how things are messaged. And that's exactly what I described to you about the breakdown in the brain. It's not any different than diabetes. It happens to happen here, the way that depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and other things happen here, but it's not any different. And what needs to shift for all of us is that, again, none of us are perfect, but also this is not a question of just pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and getting over yourself, right? That doesn't make your dopamine go from 40 to 100. That's not what repairs dopamine in the brain. So this is a PET scan looking at scans of healthy brains, so coronal sections of the brain, and that middle column is a healthy brain. And what you see, there's a lot of orange. That's dopamine. Hopefully that's a lot of us in the room. And then the column of brains over to the right are people who are struggling with addiction. And what you see in that lineup down is not a lot of dopamine. There's not a lot of orange. So that top brain is cocaine. The next one down is meth. You can tell meth, bad for the brain. It's the most harmful drug to the brain. The next one down is alcohol, and I want to just comment of how much dopamine is still active in the brain. The wheels come off the alcohol bus late in the game. It takes a while. A lot of us are functional alcoholics. We live and work with functional alcoholics. It takes a while before you get your second or third OUI, and your husband walks out on you, and your performance at work is so poor that you lose your job. It takes a while for that to happen, partly because the dysregulation in the brain is slower in acting, right? But you guys, half this building, I don't know actually your statistics, but my guess is about half this building is here for alcohol use disorder, because those are about the numbers in my building, right? I will not underplay the harm that alcohol has in our society and our families. Like, it has a terrible role. It's not a good, healthy drug for you. There's no health benefit to alcohol, despite what the alcohol industry wants you to believe. And the bottom brain is somebody with heroin. So there's 3 things that are going to set you up for addiction, okay? And I'm talking really about a young person. As once you get to a certain age, the likelihood of you developing addiction de novo from nothing is extremely low. But the 3 things are genetic risk, early exposure while the brain is developing, and a history of childhood trauma. Having poor mental health does not necessarily mean that you'll struggle with addiction. The overlay between poor mental health and addiction is really high, but instead what it is that when you are a 14-year-old kid and you have out of control anxiety, you can barely go to school every day because you can hardly show up there, and you certainly can't participate in a team sport because you're crawling out of your skin every day. When you realize that when you start drinking, you feel better again, you're the life of the party, you could show up at school as long as you had a couple nips ahead of time, you are somebody who's self-medicating for their anxiety with an addictive substance. So you fall into the category of early exposure while the brain is developing. The anxiety didn't create the addiction, the self-medication for the anxiety did, okay? So the genetics of addiction are enormous. It is hard to find any disease that has this much genetics behind it. If you have a parent or a grandparent with addiction, you have about a 50% chance of developing addiction yourself. So who needs to hear that piece of information? Yeah, everybody does, but especially your kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews, okay? And I think that seems really unfair to tell your kids about your genetic risk of addiction, because maybe they don't get to choose their genetics. They don't get to choose who their parents are, and it may be like too much to lay on them, but I'm telling you, your kids deserve to know what their risk is of addiction, because they actually get to do something about it. They actually get to fix it. If they do the next thing right, they can almost entirely erase the genetics. Because what we know is that all addiction is considered a developmental pediatric disease. It starts while your brain is developing. If you can get to the age of 23 or 24 not having used an addictive substance, the likelihood of developing an addiction is less than 2%. This is a totally preventable disease. So here I am saying you have parent or grandparent history. You're at a 50% risk at least. What if you have both of them? It's certainly higher than 50%. If you delay your use till age 23 or 24, the risk goes down to 5%. So parental history, it goes down to 5% if you just don't use anything. If you're somebody who didn't have parental history and you could just wait until your brain is fully developed, the risk of addiction goes down to about 2%. You guys, if I said that about cancer, if I looked at you and said, you will never have cancer, if you do this one thing really well until age 24, you won't get cancer, everybody would do it. Everybody would do it because people fear cancer so much. I have better treatment for cancer these days than I have for addiction. Every day, it's not that I want to diagnose people with cancer, but when I do diagnose and sit down with somebody with cancer, I think to myself, this person in front of me will do better than the person I saw who's 24 years old and shooting fentanyl. That person really, my young person, is going to die, and you are going to be okay. So if you are 15 years old and you start drinking at the age of 15, and drinking here is defined as 2 alcoholic beverages a week, 40% of those 15-year-olds go on to be alcoholics. If you wait till 21, then the rates of alcoholism go down to 7%, okay? So that is just another way of sort of showing this chasm between being a 15-year-old and a 21-year-old. And if you had waited till 23, again, the rates probably went down to 2% or less. I've done this talk actually for my inmates at Franklin County, and in that room, right, I'll have 150 at the time guys, and I'll be like, okay, who had their first addictive substance? Marijuana, alcohol, or nicotine at the age of 12, right? Because it's 12, 13, and 14 are the average age of first use in this country. And in the room, every hand is up at 12. This isn't a surprise to you guys, right? But then I start counting down, 11, 10, 9, 8. I have hands in the room at the age of 6, not one hand. Probably 10% of the room started their first substance in a building like this at the age of 6. That doesn't surprise you. You guys are in this work. You know what it's like. People's lives, their childhood, total chaos. But that's a first grader who's drinking or smoking marijuana. Are you kidding me? So let's talk about alcohol. 1/3 of Americans drink absolutely nothing, ever. And sometimes, I used to like skip over that question because I was like, oh good, I just saved a second, right? Instead I'm like, why don't you drink? And they'll say, I'm an alcoholic. And I'm like, I didn't know that about you. Tell me about that. How long have you been in recovery? It's a missing piece for me. It's not missing for them. Or they'll say, my dad was a drop-down drunk and I hated it. I hated him. I hated the smell. It is such an immediate turn-off for me that I will never drink and I won't walk into a bar. And the information I get there is I get information about their childhood. I get information about their genetics. So I no longer stop when I hear they don't drink. I say, why don't you drink? So 1/3 of Americans drink 0. 1/3 of Americans drink very lightly, a drink a week, a drink a month, very light social drinkers. And the final 1/3 of us drink every drop of alcohol in the country. And in fact, the final 10% of us drink on average 10 drinks a day. At the treatment center, I got people who drink 30 drinks a day, 40 drinks a day, right? That's their normal. But that's a big number, right? Let's talk about what a standard drink is. It doesn't take a lot to get to 10 drinks. So this is what a drink is. 1.5 ounces of hard liquor is 1 drink. Now most of us aren't pouring into a shot glass and measuring things when we pour at home, right? You're making your gin and tonic and you're like glug, 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 right? That's way more than 1.5 ounces of anything. I love sitting at a bar because I love watching a bartender, and Because they're fascinating and they're glugging. So you may go to a bar and have a cocktail, but that cocktail represents 5 drinks. You just got to know what you're drinking, my friends. You've got to pay attention to this. A beer is a 12-ounce, 5% beer, period. That's what a beer is. I drink a B Hoppy out of Worcester. It's 7.5% alcohol, and it comes in a 16-ounce can. That's 2 drinks for me. I have to acknowledge it. That's 2 beers. I actually now actively won't drink the whole thing. I'll drink half of it because I'm like, first of all, I can't afford the calories anymore. I can't afford the calories there. And I didn't mean to have 2 beers tonight. I meant to have 1. So you need to know what you're drinking. This is our real issue right now. I ask my patients every day, tell me about your relationship to alcohol. And my women will say, you know, I have a couple drinks at night. I'm like, oh yeah, what are you drinking? I drink wine. Well, how much are you pouring? You know, I pour myself a normal-sized wine glass, right? This is what a glass of wine is. It is 5 ounces. And 5 ounces in your giant mason jar on a stem at home does not look like a normal pour. You would complain at a restaurant if somebody poured you 5 ounces. But that is what a glass of wine is. And what we know about women, and in fact, I would say statistically speaking, we're getting more and more women incarcerated with alcohol because women are drinking at much higher volumes and much higher rates than we have ever seen. And this happened fast. This happened in the last 15 to 20 years. It has become very normalized for women to drink. It is encouraged for women to drink. There's this whole industry of, you know, mommy's time out and like mad housewife. You go out with your girlfriends, you always go out drinking. Right? It's just normal. And the women in this room, you may or may not nod your heads, but I know you know what I'm talking about. It is very normal to walk in after a crappy day at work and be totally overwhelmed and stressed out. And the first thing that we do and what our kids see us do is to uncork a bottle of wine or flip the top on a beer bottle, because that's what a lot of us do. That is what we do. And the message you send to your kids is when you hate your job, when you're tired, when you're overwhelmed, if you drink, it will make you better. And guess what? Most of us didn't mean to send that message to our kids. That's not the message our kids need to see. They need to see you walk into work after a crappy shift and be like, I'm gonna go take the dog for a walk. Anybody wanna come with me? I'm gonna go lie down on my yoga mat and I'm actually gonna do a 10-minute mindfulness meditation exercise because I'm a wreck right now. That's the message your kids need to see. There's very healthy ways of managing your stress. Drinking is not one of them. And I say this to you, but I say this to every audience. Because I myself used to walk out of work being like, I can't wait to have a drink, right? And the minute I think I can't wait to have this, I don't get to drink that night because I'm craving, right? I'm self-medicating for stress. And the moment that thought enters, I just cut myself off. And I'm not an alcoholic, but I found myself developing an unhealthier interaction with alcohol. And now, quite honestly, I'm almost 50, it is not worth the calories. Most of us could stand to lose, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 12 pounds. Like most of us. I'm not saying anybody in this room, but you know how it is. This stuff is full of calories and it is not worth it. And again, what you know is that this gets people into a hot mess of trouble. Okay, leading causes of death. I like doing this one because when I'm in front of nursing students or medical students, they're always like, ooh, I know the answer, and they do know the answers, right? The leading causes of death when asked on a medical boards are either heart disease or cancer, depending on the state. The answer used to always be heart disease and cancer was second, but last year, 27 states flipped so that cancer actually overrode heart disease. And the third leading cause of death is stroke. But that's not how I think about what kills you. The real leading causes of death, the things that really kill you, the number 1 is tobacco, by a long shot. Number 2 is lack of exercise and poor diet, and number 3 is alcohol. Those are the things that kill you. Those things cause the strokes and the cardiovascular disease. That's what causes the disease. 2 of the top 3 leading causes of death in our country are substances. Right? Yet what most of us learned in medical training about substance abuse and how to treat it was close to 0, which is, it's laughable. When I say that aloud, I'm like, what is wrong with training of nurses and doctors and NPs in this country? It's wrong. So this was in, I think it was in The Guardian, just talking about that alcohol is a more harmful drug even than heroin. In spite of all the people dropping dead of heroin overdose, more people die every year from alcohol-related diseases. So I will not underplay that. It's a problem. I actually think the legal age to buy alcohol really probably should be 25. Now, that's not happening. No one will let that happen, but probably it should be closer to that. And this is just a graph that looks at the harm to others and the harm to the self. The dark is harm to others, the light blue is harm to the self, and alcohol surpasses heroin at that top line substantially. So let's talk about the third thing that will create the disease of addiction in a human being. The third thing is something called adverse childhood experiences, or having a high ACE score. So the ACE study came out in 1996, and it was a very well done study. When it came out, everybody was like, holy smokes, this is super complicated. I can't believe they pulled it off. It was done in Kaiser, San Diego, mainly middle class, white population that was studied here. They asked 17,000 adults, what happened to you under the age of 18 in your house growing up? Let me just ask you 10 questions about what may or may not have happened to you. The answers are yes or no. I'm going to read some of the questions, almost all of them, so you understand what I'm talking about. Nobody can read this from where you're sitting. Did a parent or another adult in your household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically harmed? Did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks? Were you sexually abused? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, that your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or that your parents were too drunk or too high to take you to the doctor when you were sick? Did you watch your mom or your stepmom be physically or verbally abused by your dad or your stepdad? Were your parents separated or divorced? Was there somebody in your household with major mental illness? Did somebody in your household go to prison? 10 questions, yes or no. If you score a 6 or a higher on an ACE score, you've basically just shaved 20 years off your life. If you score a 4 or higher on an ACE score, you're at much higher risk of heart attacks, emphysema, asthma, multiple broken bones, multiple sexual partners, much, much, much higher risk of developing addiction, period. What happens to you as a child impacts the development of your organ structure, of your cellular structure. It impacts your coping skills. And when you grow up in a household that is neglectful, abusive, and completely chaotic, it puts you in this fight or flight response all the time. And remember, the way that we are designed as human beings is we're designed to be okay, pretty good, a little hungry most of the time, but we got this, and then we get chased by a bear. And when you get chased by a bear, you get this enormous spike in cortisol, and you run. You're the fastest person on the planet at that moment. And for 20 minutes, you have an incredibly high cortisol response, and then you are safe, and you shelter down, and you're better, right? Your sympathetic response goes up when you're running, and then when you quiet, your parasympathetic kicks in. That is the way we are designed to be. 3 times a year, for 20 minutes, you're on fire. That's the way it's supposed to be from an evolutionary standpoint. But when you are a child growing up in a household where you are worried about when your next meal is coming, when you're worried about the safety of your little sister or your mom, when you're scared of the creaking steps every night when you're lying in bed, you are a child who's living with spiking cortisol in your brain every day of the year for years on end. And this is a neurotoxic drug to the brain. It has an impact on the development of every organ, and it impacts your coping skills. It impacts what you turn to feel normal again. This is what trauma looks like. And trauma impacts your health, period. And were you to do, and I'm sure you've done it, at least your treatment staff has done it, an ACE score on people who are incarcerated, what do you think those numbers are? Yeah, so I did it once. I did the ACE score on 150 guys, and it was actually one of the saddest days of my last decade, right? Because they wanted to hand them to me, and they wanted to talk about it. I wasn't prepared for that. What's interesting about doing that study, that score, is that people actually, they want to talk about, as they should, right? I had never had so many 10s, right? I actually charted it out one day. There was nobody who scored a 0, right? That's not a surprise to anybody. There was a handful of people who just scored a 1, but almost everybody was a 4 or higher. And 20 to 40% of the room was a 9 or a 10, right? Like every horrible thing that actually shouldn't happen to most kids happened to people who get arrested, right? No wonder they're running, using, shooting, not coping, and end up here, right? They're a hot, bloody mess. They just are. I get it. I'm not saying they didn't deserve the sentence or spend time behind bars. Don't mishear me. But I am saying the question is, what happened to these people? Because a lot of terrible things happen to children. So 3 things that are going to predispose you to addiction: early exposure while the brain is developing, a bad, high-risk genetic background, and a high ACE score. You want to run from trauma, you want to run from sadness, you're going to drink or drug, right? It's a coping skill. It's not a healthy one, but it is one. So there's no doubt in my mind that pills are on the hook for today's opiate epidemic. And I don't think anybody could not argue that way. The overprescribing of opiates since 1996 at the hand of people like me with a big fat prescription pad in her pocket, right? We started this epidemic. The problem is that most of us aren't stepping up and managing this epidemic, but the pills have been on the hook. When you look at the entire nation, this map is a little old, it only goes to 2014, but it starts in 2003, and these red areas are places where people are dying from overdoses. And you just watch the whole country light up. We don't have fentanyl arriving in the US in any measurable way until really 2015. So this map ends at 2014. If I had 2018 data, almost the entire country would be deep maroon at this point in terms of overdose deaths, with the exception of North Dakota, right? North Dakota somehow looks pretty good, but the rest of the country is a wreck right now with opiates. I told you guys I'm from Massachusetts, and I've lived in New England for a long time, and I trained here, and I've always actually worked only in New England. Most of the pills that came to New England did not come from New England prescribers. When you look at our prescribing pattern across all the states in New England, we weren't heavy prescribers. Most of the pills came to us for a good 10 or 12 years from the state of Florida. So we used to call I95 Oxy Highway. And there were 650 pill mills or pain clinics in the state of Florida. And you could just go down there. In fact, there would be sort of tour operations that would pay your way down there, coach ride, all the movies, all your food, your hotel, and all you needed to do was to walk into 2 pain clinics a day with a stack of cash. And you walked out with a stack of scripts and a bag of pills. And then you handed it to your tour operator, who went back to Maine and Western Massachusetts and Kentucky and sold it, right? That is the way it worked for over a decade. The aughts to 2009 or 2010, this is the way it looked. In 2009, the federal government looked at the state of Florida and said, you are destroying the eastern seaboard. We don't know what is wrong with you people. We would like to cut off your peninsula and send you out to sea, but instead we're going to cut off all federal funding if you do not get your pill mills under control. The DEA went in, they shut down nearly every one of the pain clinics. They sent 34 licensed doctors to prison, federal prison, because they were not doctors, they were drug dealers. And the problem is, I have now just shut down my entire pipeline of pills, and I have at least 2 million Americans addicted to opiates. What are you left with? Yes, the unintended consequence of a really good action is that in 2010, 11, and 12, we start to see spiking amounts of heroin everywhere. It is everywhere, and it was everywhere in 2009. There was no small town that you couldn't text somebody and get an Uber to bring you heroin. There's a great book at the end that will talk about the wide distribution and how smart it is, how high-tech it is, and how nonviolent it is, right? This isn't a violent drug problem we have, right? We're not having, are there gangs out there? Are there people killing each other? A little bit, but it's not like it was in the 80s. This has been kind of a low violence problem. This looks from 1968 till today, the number of people in the country, in the United States, who died of car accidents. Why has that number gone down? Yeah, seatbelts, safer cars, that's right. That's public health measures. That's what changes things. This is people dying of gun violence. The numbers actually, it increased for a while. It's actually pretty flat. AIDS. There was no AIDS, and then in the 80s it came. And it wasn't until the early aughts that we finally had treatment. These days, if you have AIDS, you'll be alive till the end of your life, right? You see me every now and then, I make sure you're taking your meds, you're all good. It's a chronic condition just like diabetes, it's no different. But for those of us who were doctors during the AIDS epidemic, I lost so many patients. And then that dark purple line is drug overdose deaths. And this only goes to 2015, so that ended at 52,000, last year was 72,000, this year could be 90,000, we don't know the numbers. But this now surpasses, the death by opiate overdose surpasses every other unintentional cause of death. It's the #1 killer under the age of 50. That's where we are today, right? You guys are in the midst. You are living through and working through the midst of today's opiate epidemic. So when you ask EMS, the biggest concern to them, those dark green areas, the problem has been heroin. Although this map has shifted in the last year, the heroin is now everywhere. But When you look at states where there's still heavy prescribing of prescription pills, it's those dark states that light up. There's still a lot of prescribers handing out a lot of opiates. And this remains true. I have a map from last year, county by county, of every county levels of prescribed opiates, and it's not New England. There's like one county that lights up a little bit in New England, but it's really in the South and in Appalachia where there's still heavy-handed use of prescriptions. And while you still have prescription opiates available, heroin doesn't need to take over the market. And can you die from a prescription opiate? Of course you can, right? But the rates of death are way lower than they are with heroin and fentanyl, right? Once you launch into heroin and fentanyl, that's when people really start to die and when people really start to get even sicker. The red states here are the heroin states, and I just want you to look at the facts that those two maps don't overlie each other. They are distinct from each other. Purple states here are the dark blue states, very high prescribed opiates. Red states here, very high heroin and fentanyl. As of January 1st of 2019, Medicare will stop paying for opiates for old people over a certain threshold. The threshold's very low. And as Medicare goes, Medicaid will go and the commercial insurances will go. So as of January of 2019, the ability to get prescribed opiates, even for people who really actually need them, are doing fine and are not addicted or not diverting, will plummet. In those purple states where those doctors are prescribing a lot, they will have no recourse. And people who are struggling with an addiction to their prescribed opiates will convert to heroin. And so what we will see in my prediction is in the next 2 years, even increasing numbers of death by opiate overdose. Let's talk about incarceration rates worldwide. The United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the entire world. We incarcerate more people than Russia does, South Africa, and we incarcerate way more than lots of the other countries. So 702 Americans are locked up out of every 100,000 Americans. When you look at us, this is a breakdown. Those gray areas are US states, and the orange lines are actually countries. Our states, state by state, lock up, of course, more than any other country. Oklahoma, as a state, incarcerates more human beings than any other place on the planet. They are doing a lot of reform of their criminal justice system because guess what? Incarcerating people is really expensive. And guess what? It doesn't really make people all that much better. If we can take the people that are going to harm other people and keep them out of harming other people, that is important, right? But we incarcerate people for not paying fines, for a substance use problem. We incarcerate for reasons that are not about protecting other people. We incarcerate just because we're kind of pissed at them. And again, this is a place where across all political spectrums, many people believe that criminal justice reform needed to happen yesterday. So really very alarming when you look at what we do in this country in terms of locking people up. 1980 is that little gray bar here. In 2014 is the green bar. And you can see what the rates of incarceration were in the state system, the federal system, and then in county and town jail. So just an enormous jump. Are we safer? Are we better off than we were in 1980? Are things all fixed in our country because we put everybody behind bars? Is that the way it worked? No. We spent a lot of taxpayer dollars. Quite honestly, I really need to go to my kids' public schools. That's where I really need the money to go right now. Substance use and incarceration is just what you guys already know, that when we look at the statistics in Massachusetts, between 80 and 90-something% of our people, it's not the only reason they're incarcerated, but it is a big part of their incarceration is a substance use disorder, whether it's to alcohol or opiates or methamphetamine or cocaine, whatever it is. That's why you're behind bars. And that holds up in the federal system too. Less so because there's a lot of other white-collar crime in the federal system. The risk of dying after you leave us is really high. It's 120 times the rate when you walk out the door of a jail that you're going to die. Now here we are, $54,000 we invest in people, invest to keep them away from other people, right? And then we let them out the door so that they can die? Really? That seems like a giant waste of money. If we're going to lock people up, you know what I want? I want them to get better and never come back here again. And that's really what all of you want too. I actually don't mind that I could lose my job someday. I would love to lose a few jobs right now. And the truth is, shrinking our prison population may not be good for the local economy, right? But it's good for society. And getting people better so that they don't commit crimes and harm other human beings and coming back here, that actually is our goal, right? And it's the work that needs to be done. So the rates of overdose are particularly high in the first 7 or 30 days. That is when you will die. And our inmates, before they leave, need to understand that. We need to be talking to them about it. Everybody, and it's the work you guys do. Everybody needs to know how to use Narcan. They need to be given Narcan. But the truth is, we need to say, I know you're going to smoke cigarettes. It's terrible for you. What can I do to stop that? Let's get a plan. I know you're going to want to go out and use heroin, but that's a terrible plan too, because you haven't used heroin in 18 months, and there is no fentanyl-free heroin anymore. You will die. So if you're suicidal, I need to hear that. But if you just think you want to relapse, I need to help prevent that. People get better with addiction. I know they do, because I've been at this for 18 years, and I see young people walk in my office who look like that woman on the left and end up looking like the woman on the right, right? People get better, they do. You have family members who've gotten better with addiction. I work with people who are in recovery every single day. People get better. And you have to believe that. Is it on the same schedule I want it to be on? Never, right? Are there lots of hiccups in the road? Absolutely there are. So what does it take to get better? It takes a lot of things to get better. To get better, and it can't happen in jail, because jail is a false reality, right? You can be all fixed up in jail, but the stressors in jail are very different than your stressors at home. Not being able to pay the bills, having your girlfriend scream at you, losing your house. I mean, jail is a cakewalk in comparison in some ways to really living out there. I have one of my guys who's really spent more than half of his life in jail, and he'll say to me, I hate being on the outside. It's too hard out here. I want to go back. And I'm like, this is terrible. Every time I see you, tell me how you want to go back to jail. This is so not okay. But the truth is, I know his life is better in jail. It is. But that's not a good thing, right? So to get better with any disease, you need a lot of things coming your way. You need housing. You need stable, sober housing. And as my reentry workers will tell you, where the hell is that? Where do people go where they can stay sober? It's very hard to find stable, sober housing anywhere in this country, and Western Mass is not an exception to that. We could invest in long-term sober living by even 20-fold, and we still would not have enough housing. And it's the biggest hurdle in every jail. It's the biggest hurdle in every treatment center. Because if they're just going to go home and live with the girlfriend again, I guarantee you, it's not going to work. It is not going to work. So every circle, when I sit there and draw a circle, every circle has housing on it. And if you don't have housing, you're screwed. But lots of other things make you better. You need lots of therapy. You need to have a sense of purpose. You need to go to work. You need to go to school. You need to fall in love with an animal, a horse, a person. You need to restore relationships with people in your life that you have caused harm to. I believe in medicine for alcohol and opiate use disorder. There's no good medicine for cocaine, but the medicine helps. It's not 100% of the game. Maybe it's only 30%, but for some people it's 60%, right? So, but it plays some role on this puzzle of staying sober, because every piece of evidence points to that. Some people's pies are super complicated because they really have a lot of things not going in their favor, and it takes a lot of things to get better. I'm a big believer in 12-step recovery. If that works for you, I'm absolutely in on it. Falling in love with yourself is the most important thing. There's no one who hates themselves or has more self-loathing than the addict, right? You don't need to make them feel bad. They already feel bad. I guarantee you that. So you guys all know, because you're smart, and some of you have struggled with nicotine addiction, there's a lot of treatments we give people for stopping smoking, including the ones that you can buy at the gas station, the vaping, the juuling. That's another way to get off cigarettes. There are a lot of ways, or at least 3 ways, that are evidence-based to get off and stay away from and get your life back on track from opiates. And these are the 3: methadone, buprenorphine, also called Suboxone, and naltrexone, also called Vivitrol. From now on, I will use the brand names because I think they're the more common. I want to talk about methadone, because methadone is one of these things. People hate methadone, they're scared of methadone, they don't know anything about methadone, but let's talk about methadone. Methadone we have been using in this country since the early 1970s. This is a study that came out of Sweden in 1981. I was in junior high school when this study came out, but it's my favorite study because it's really well done. 34 people are struggling with heroin, okay? Those are the H's here, the red H's. And they look at the 34 and they say, half of you can go to methadone clinic and half of you just need to get better. Get better, go to meetings, figure it out, stop using heroin, it's bad for you, okay? And then 2 years later, they followed them. And this is the group that was in the methadone clinic. All those green people are good. They're going to methadone or they're not going to methadone. They got their lives back, they weaned off their methadone, they're going to school. They're good, okay? They're not using heroin, their life is back on track. One of them is in jail. P is prison here. So one went to jail. 4 of them are still using heroin. In the group that wasn't offered methadone, 1 of them got better on their own. All good, awesome work. 2 are in jail. The rest of the reds are still using heroin. The 2 blacks are dead. Number one of the heroin users, sepsis and endocarditis. One had their leg amputated and the other one had sepsis. That was $300,000 right there, okay? A lot of money in the group that wasn't offered a drug that cost pennies. So they looked at the group that wasn't offered methadone and were like, would you like to come to the methadone clinic? Because it seems like that's really working for those people and it might work for you. So they scooted everybody who wanted to be into the methadone clinic into the methadone clinic. And all those green people are still doing good. That one who was good to begin with is still doing good. In my crowd here, 3 are still using heroin, 1's still in jail, 1 got better. In this group here, the greens are all good. Now 3 are in jail and 5 died. Methadone is an incredibly effective, well-researched, been around forever drug. The problem with methadone is not the drug, it's availability, right? Super hard to get to. We have 1 clinic in this county. I got 1 clinic in my county, and they're both closed to new patients because they're full, because we're in the middle of an opiate epidemic. And you know what? If you're in the middle of the opiate epidemic, you probably need to open methadone clinics times 5. That's probably what needed to happen, and it hasn't happened yet. So this is a very effective drug. When people are stable on their methadone, you sure as hell better keep them on their methadone to help their stability. And what do we do instead? Because I do this in my jail too, is we yank you off your methadone down to 0, and that is a miserable ride. Maybe we do it over 3 days using a little methadone, right? But that's the most I'm legally allowed to write for. I give you comfort meds. The comfort meds do squat. I make you suffer. You are sick. And I have completely destabilized your health, period, right? And that is what the Essex lawsuit was about, that specifically case. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the challenges of methadone in the jail. It's not the challenge you guys think. It's not the administration. It's all easy. The administration's all easy. We know how to do it. Rhode Island's done it. Vermont's done it. Rikers has been doing it. We do it in Greenfield. This is all easy. It's actually the federal government's restrictions on methadone. There's a lot of hoops you got to jump through. It's a pain in the butt. And I'm in the middle of the pain in the butt process right now. But it's doable, but it's not so pretty. So what makes people better? Some people get better on their own. That's great. I want them to get better on their own. But when you do studies, this is a 3-year span of time where we follow people struggling with an opiate use disorder. The green line is you need to get better, you need to go to meetings, stop using heroin, and the relapse rate is pretty high. The blue line in this picture is Suboxone or buprenorphine. The red line is methadone, and the relapse rate is low. Is it perfect? Of course it isn't perfect. Do people screw it up? Of course they do. Do they sell my Suboxone? Yes, they do. I get pissed at them, right? You can misuse any drug you want, right? But 60% of people on methadone and about that level on Suboxone do fine. They need to be monitored. They need other things coming their way because the drug alone is not the fix. It is part of the fix, but they really do much, much better. And when I have young people dropping dead, why am I not using the best tool in my toolbox? Why am I not doing it? When you look at the cost of this stuff, it is still less expensive to use methadone and buprenorphine and pay for the doctor's visit to see me and the urine drug screen to see me than relapse, because every time people relapse, they die. Expensive, or they nearly die and they shoot an infection to their heart valve, or they create an abscess in their spinal cord and they're in the hospital for 6 to 8 weeks, right? The diseases related to opiate use disorder are unbelievably expensive, and they are actually bankrupting hospitals right now. This is not an inexpensive disease to treat. So what's the best treatment? The one that works. That's all. Best treatment's the one that's going to work for them, right? How do you know? I don't know how you know. You have to ask. Where have you ever done well? Has there been a period of time in the last 5 years that you've been struggling where you had some stability? You had your life back. When was that? And they'll say, I was good. I was good for 9 months. I moved out to the backwoods of Vermont. I was living in a cabin. There was nothing there. I'm like, okay, that sounds like a great plan. How do I get you back to the cabin, right? Or they'll say, I was going to Suboxone clinic. It was all good. I lost my insurance, and I've been running ever since. And I'm like, okay, I can fix that. We'll get you back on your insurance, and let's get you back on that. So I usually just ask. Or they'll say, I went to Suboxone clinic. I sold all my drug. I used to shoot it. I'm like, okay, I hear that. Yeah, that seemed like a good drug for you. It seems like you developed a bad relationship with that drug. Maybe now we're going to walk away from that. Or maybe your life has changed so much, your people, your places, your brain has shifted so much, we could possibly revisit it, but I'm probably not going to do that right away. So I just have an exploration with them about what they've tried, how did it go, what else can we consider. I want to talk about naltrexone, also called Vivitrol, because in the jails, that's what we've used. Now, why have we used it? Because it's free, it's given to us by the drug company. Does that mean it's better? Well, it's free, it's cheap, but does it work well? And some of our county houses of corrections will say it's great, everybody takes it and then they come back every month for years on end. And I say I've seen no evidence of that. And when we followed our own patients getting Vivitrol out of the Franklin County House of Corrections, a very small number were still getting the shot at 3 months, and most of them were relapsing, right? That for me is not a particularly successful drug. I have a handful of my own patients that I take care of in my primary care office who are on month 15 or 18, and they've been doing great. But they're a real small number, right? And so this study came out this year in 2018, and it compared two groups of people on Suboxone compared to people on Vivitrol. And in this study, over a span of 6 months, they were about equal. The problem was to get to the shot, the Vivitrol was super hard. Because to get to the Vivitrol or the naltrexone, you need to be at least 10 days free of the opiate. That's easy to do when you're in jail. Everybody's 10-day free of their opiate. I can give everybody a Vivitrol shot if I wanted to. But when you're out in the real world, buying 10 free days and having me document you haven't used in 10 days is super challenging. So there was bias in the sense that the group that was able to struggle through that 10 days and get to the Vivitrol may have been a little bit of a different ball of wax than the group on Suboxone. It was comparing apples to oranges. So again, our success in real time with naltrexone is not as high as it is with methadone and buprenorphine. And it's one thing if you have a reentry worker who hauls your person every month in to get their shot and you know it's happening, that's great. But most correctional places don't have that level of reentry care, right? You guys hauling everybody to their Vivitrol appointments for months and years on end? Of course you're not, right? Because who's paying for that? Nobody, right? Although it would be a good investment of money. It really, truly would. Okay, so these are the drugs out there. Buprenorphine comes in a couple different forms. There are these implants that go underneath the arm. We're pretty anxious about those in a house of correction because they're not that hard to remove, and getting the drug out of the implant, I think, is quite easy. So I personally, although I considered it for a while, I myself would not be inserting those at the jail. There's the injectable form of buprenorphine. There's two versions of it. There's one that's on the market that creates like a little rubber eraser-sized release system in the subcutaneous fat that releases the drug, and it lasts for a month. Seems like an awesome idea because you can't sell it, right? Is it manipulatable in a jail or in another place? Sure, you can manipulate anything. And I think that the chemistry that it would take to cut it out, dissolve it, extract it, is probably not that difficult. I think it's all available in the commissary. Now, I'm not a chemist. I don't manipulate drugs in my kitchen, but I think I love the fact that you are checking everybody who has the implant, check it every day. Make sure it's still there. You should be able to feel it under the skin. Make sure there's no incision mark and it hasn't been removed, because I don't want that drug in the building, okay? Essex County, November 28th, 2018. First big decision, federal judge said that it is in violation of the American Disabilities Act. It's also in violation of the 8th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America not to give treatment to people who are struggling with addiction. In this specific case was a young man who had an OUI, or actually a motor vehicle offense. He's been stable on his methadone for 2 years, all good, and it finally made it through the court system, and then they were like, you owe us 90 days. And he's like, but I'm on methadone, and Essex was like, tough luck. And so the judge said, no, you have to get him his methadone. You have to figure out a way to do that. And in his case, you know, his methadone clinic is 5 minutes from the jail, right? This is a fixable problem. And so Essex County is one of our many great houses of corrections in Massachusetts that now has to dig in deep and figure out how to make it work. But this is going to be considered really very shortly the law of the land. And we're doing this talk, we're talking about changing our perception of addiction because it's actually the right thing to do. Our job in the medical side, I'm a medical person, I'm not a correctional person, I'm not law enforcement, I'm the doctor. My job is to make sure that people's health needs are being met and that the needs that we're meeting meet the standard of care in our community. And when you're not giving people treatment for their addiction, you are not meeting the standard of care in community, period. And as the liability, all the weight ends up with me, my job is to make sure people get the treatment they deserve in a jail, period. That is our job. So whether it's from a federal judge and you're coming into this kicking and screaming, or whether it's because just the right thing to do and it actually may be saving some lives, we all need to jump on this lovely bandwagon together and get good at it. So these are all really great books on addiction. Any one of them I would recommend. I think the book called Dreamland is about the distribution of heroin in the country, how smart and fast and high tech it was. It was super planned out way in advance of every Florida pill mill getting shut down. From a law enforcement standpoint, I think that's a great read. The Body Keeps the Score is the best book on trauma I've ever read. If you want to help understand what it is that people who have a history of childhood trauma feel and how to make them better, that's your book. If you're a treatment person, you need to have read it. We need more trauma treatment at our jails. I just guarantee you that. It has to happen. It's not easy always to do, but it needs to happen for people to truly get better. But any one of these books are excellent. I have a website. Let's pretend you saw this and you're like, I need to go back and relearn something. I want to go talk about this myself somewhere. I want to talk at my kids' school. I have talks. You go watch the talk, I'll send you the slide deck. Any talk you want to give, I'll send you the slide deck. You can say it's all your own, I don't care. But you want to rehearse it a little bit ahead of time, and you can rehearse it on the website because there's YouTube videos there. You've been a very nice audience. Thanks for having me here. Thank you.